The dining room fell silent in a way that felt unnatural. Forks froze midair. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations collapsed into a single, unbearable stillness. In the center of the Alamo Grill House, one of the most expensive restaurants along the San Antonio River Walk, a 78-year-old woman sat trembling in a wheelchair. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She wore a faded blue dress, carefully pressed that afternoon, and a thin cardigan her late husband had once bought her from a clearance rack years ago. Her hands rested politely on her lap, fingers knotted with arthritis, eyes wide, not with fear, but with confusion. Standing over her was Robert Hale, the owner of the restaurant. His face was flushed red with anger. In his right hand, he held a porcelain bowl filled to the brim with steaming lobster bisque. The smell of cream and shellfish filled the air. "This is not a place for people like you," Robert shouted, loud enough for every table to hear. "Begging belongs on the sidewalk, not in my dining room." Evelyn lifted her eyes slowly. There were tears there, yes, but also a dignity so quiet it was almost painful to witness. "Sir," she whispered, her voice thin but steady, "I only wanted—" "Only wanted what?" Robert snapped. "To embarrass real customers? To ruin the atmosphere?" And then he did it. With one sharp, cruel motion, Robert tilted the bowl forward. The soup poured down onto Evelyn's legs, scalding, soaking through her dress, splashing against the metal frame of her wheelchair. She gasped, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming. Robert laughed, a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the polished wood walls. "Well," he sneered, pointing at her, "it's not like you're going anywhere, right?" At that moment, a young woman rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside the wheelchair. "Grandma!" she cried. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Her name was Mia Carter. What Robert Hale didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that from a quiet table near the window, a man had watched everything. He hadn't touched his food. He hadn't looked away once. And now, he was standing up. Before we continue, I want to invite you into something deeper than just a story. If stories like this, stories of justice, mercy, and unexpected encounters, touch something inside you, then I invite you to become part of our family here on YouTube, Heaven Walks With Us. Every day, we share stories that remind us of one powerful truth. God still walks among us, sometimes in ways we don't recognize at first. If this story is already stirring your heart, take a moment to subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? What time is it where you are? Your voice matters here. Now, let's go back to the night that changed everything. 3 hours before the dining room fell into that terrible silence, Evelyn Carter sat by the window of a small apartment on the west side of San Antonio. The apartment was modest, one bedroom, peeling paint, furniture older than most of the neighbors' cars, but it was spotless. Everything had its place. Everything had a story. Evelyn sat in her wheelchair with a knitted blanket folded neatly over her knees, a rosary resting between her fingers. Her hands moved slowly, bead by bead, the way they had every evening for decades. The front door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, breathless. "Grandma," Mia called out, trying, and failing, to hide the nervous excitement in her voice. Evelyn looked up and smiled. "I'm here, sweetheart." Mia crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking both of her grandmother's hands. "I have a surprise," she said. Evelyn chuckled softly. "At my age, surprises usually mean doctor appointments." "This one is different," Mia said, her eyes shining. "I promise." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a reservation card. Evelyn squinted at it. "The Alamo Grill House?" she read slowly. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then something flickered across her face, something young, something long buried. "My Robert," she whispered. Mia swallowed. "Grandpa used to work there, right?" Evelyn nodded. He washed dishes in the back, came home every night smelling like garlic and butter. He used to say—" Her voice trembled. "One day, Evie, I'll bring you there. We'll sit by the window like royalty." She looked down at her hands. "But there was always something else we needed money for. Medicine, rent, you kids." Mia squeezed her hands tighter. "I saved for 6 months," she said quietly. "Extra shifts, no new clothes, no eating out." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Tonight," Mia continued, her voice shaking now, "we're going to that restaurant, you and me, just like he promised." Evelyn closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Oh, my girl," she whispered. "God bless you." They spent the next half hour getting ready. Mia brushed Evelyn's silver hair until it shone, helped her into her best dress, dabbed a hint of rose-scented perfume on her wrists. When Evelyn looked at herself in the mirror, she smiled. "I look presentable," she said. Mia smiled back. "You look beautiful." Neither of them knew what awaited them behind those glass doors, and neither of them knew that God had already arrived there before they did. The taxi arrived just as the sun dipped behind the buildings, painting the San Antonio skyline in shades of amber and gold. Mia carefully helped her grandmother into the back seat, folding the wheelchair with practiced hands and sliding it into the trunk. She climbed in beside Evelyn, closing the door gently, as if afraid a sudden sound might shatter the fragile joy filling the car. The driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror and smiled politely. "River Walk?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Mia replied. As the car pulled away, Evelyn pressed her forehead lightly against the window. The city moved past her like a slow, living memory, streetlights flickering on, storefronts glowing, people laughing on sidewalks. "Oh," Evelyn murmured, pointing softly, "that bakery on the corner. I worked there one summer when I was 15. Mia leaned closer. "Really?" Evelyn nodded. "I burned more bread than I sold," she said with a quiet laugh. "But your grandfather used to wait outside every evening, pretending he just happened to be passing by." They passed a small park, then a church with its doors still open, warm light spilling onto the steps. "That's where your mother was baptized," Evelyn said, "and you too." Mia smiled, but her throat tightened. These stories always did that, made the past feel close enough to touch, and painfully far away at the same time. The closer they got to downtown, the faster Evelyn's heart seemed to beat. When the taxi finally stopped, Mia stepped out first. She opened the door for her grandmother, unfolded the wheelchair, and helped her settle into it. Evelyn looked up. The Alamo Grill House stood before them exactly as she remembered from faded photographs. Arched windows, polished stone, soft golden lights glowing from inside. Valet attendants moved briskly, doors opening and closing, laughter drifting out with the scent of expensive food. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. "Maybe this was a silly idea," she whispered. "We can go somewhere else. Somewhere simpler." Mia knelt in front of her, gripping her hands. "No," she said gently. "This is where we're supposed to be." She stood, straightened her shoulders, and pushed the wheelchair toward the entrance. As the glass doors opened, cool air brushed Evelyn's face. The murmur of conversation washed over them, deep voices, clinking glasses, soft music. The host looked up. His eyes traveled slowly and unmistakably from Evelyn's wheelchair to her worn shoes to Mia's plain jacket. Something shifted in his expression, and in that instant, before a single word was spoken, Evelyn felt it, that familiar tightening in her chest, the quiet knowledge that they had just crossed into a place where not everyone was welcome. The host cleared his throat. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his voice polite on the surface, but flat beneath it. Mia shook her head. "No, sir, but we were hoping—" The host glanced past them into the dining room. Every table looked full at first glance, but only if you didn't look too closely. A candle here, a folded napkin there, empty chairs waiting. "I'll check," he said quickly, already turning away. Evelyn lowered her eyes. She felt the familiar heat creeping up her neck, the quiet shame she thought she'd learned to ignore after all these years. They waited near the entrance. People passed by them in tailored jackets and polished shoes. Some glanced at the wheelchair and looked away. Others stared just a second too long before pretending not to notice. Mia stood still, one hand resting on the handle of the wheelchair, her jaw tight. After a moment, footsteps approached. The host returned, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a tall man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a watch that caught the light every time he moved. His hair was neatly styled, his expression was controlled, confident, practiced. This was Robert Hale. "Good evening," Robert said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I'm the owner." Mia nodded respectfully. "Good evening, sir." "I'm afraid we don't have any tables available tonight," Robert continued smoothly. Mia hesitated. "Sir, I can see at least 3 empty tables right there." Robert followed her gaze, then smiled thinly. "Those are reserved." "All of them?" Mia asked. "Yes," he replied without blinking. "All of them." The silence that followed felt heavy. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly in her lap. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words came anyway. "It's my birthday," she said softly. 78. Robert looked down at her. For a moment something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by amusement. "Well," he said lightly, "happy birthday." A few nearby diners chuckled, unsure whether they were allowed to laugh. "My husband," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling now. "He worked here many years ago. He promised he'd bring me some day." Robert's smile sharpened. "I'm sorry," he said, though there was no apology in his tone. "This restaurant is for paying guests, not for nostalgia." Mia stepped forward. "We can pay," she said firmly. "I saved for this." Robert's eyes flicked to her jacket, her shoes, the wheelchair. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he replied. "If you're looking for charity, there are churches nearby." Mia felt her hands shake. Evelyn closed her eyes. "Come, sweetheart," she whispered. "We'll go." As the host moved to escort them out, someone stood up from a table near the window, a man wearing a beige sweater, and all eyes, slowly, turned toward him. The man stood slowly without urgency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his hands. He didn't demand attention. And yet, somehow, the entire room felt drawn toward him. He was of average height, wearing a simple beige sweater, faded jeans, and worn leather shoes. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him suggested power, but his presence carried weight. "Excuse me," he said calmly, looking toward Robert Hale. "I believe there's a table available." Robert turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." The man gestured gently toward the table beside the window, the one he had been sitting at. "My table," he said. "I've finished my meal. They're welcome to sit there." A murmur rippled through the dining room. Robert let out a short, humorless laugh. "I decide who sits where in my restaurant." The man met his gaze. There was no challenge in his eyes, no anger. Only a steady, searching calm that made Robert shift his weight without realizing why. "Your restaurant," the man repeated softly. "Of course." He turned then, away from Robert and toward Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said, kneeling so his eyes were level with hers, "please come with me." Evelyn stared at him, uncertain. "Sir, we don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing anything," he replied gently. "You're simply sitting down." Mia hesitated, glancing at Robert. "Are you sure?" The man smiled at her, not a wide smile, but one filled with warmth. "I'm sure." Without waiting for permission, he guided them to the table by the window. The waiter, visibly nervous, placed menus down and poured water with shaking hands. Robert stood frozen. Something was happening that he didn't understand, and worse, something he couldn't control. He clenched his jaw and followed them. "You think you can undermine me in my own establishment?" he said sharply. The man looked up at him. "I'm not undermining you," he said. "I'm making room." Robert scoffed. "For what? Pity?" "For dignity," the man answered. That single word struck Robert harder than he expected. Evelyn picked up the menu, her hands trembling. She didn't read a word. She was simply absorbing the moment, sitting at a table she had dreamed of for more than 50 years. Robert's face darkened. He turned abruptly toward a nearby table where a server had just placed a fresh bowl of lobster bisque. Without warning, he reached out, lifted the bowl, and before anyone could react, the man in the beige sweater felt something shift in the air, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The bowl felt heavier than it looked. Robert Hale's fingers tightened around the porcelain as steam curled upward, fogging his vision for just a moment. The lobster bisque was fresh from the kitchen, thick, creamy, dangerously hot. A server froze beside him. "Sir." But Robert had already made his decision. With a sharp, violent motion, he tipped the bowl forward. The soup cascaded down onto Evelyn Carter's lap. It soaked through her dress in seconds, splashing against the metal frame of the wheelchair, dripping onto the polished floor. Evelyn inhaled sharply, her body jerking from the sudden heat. A sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but something quieter and more heartbreaking. A gasp she tried to swallow. Mia cried out and dropped to her knees instantly. "Grandma! Oh my God, Grandma!" She grabbed napkins from the table, pressing them uselessly against the soaked fabric, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold on. Evelyn clenched her jaw. Her fingers dug into the armrests of the wheelchair. Pain shot through her legs, legs that already betrayed her daily, but she refused to cry out. Years of endurance had taught her something pride never could. Across the dining room, a glass shattered. Someone had dropped it. Robert laughed. It wasn't nervous, it wasn't accidental. It was loud, deliberate, and cruel. "Well," he said, pointing at Evelyn as if she were a spectacle, "what are you going to do now? Run?" A few diners looked down at their plates. Others stared openly, horrified but silent. "Look at you," Robert continued. "You can't even stand up to clean yourself." Mia turned on him, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it, please. She's hurting." Robert leaned back, folding his arms. "That's what happens when you don't know your place." The words landed like blows. The waiter who had served the soup stood frozen, his face pale, eyes burning with shame. Another server quietly stepped away, unable to watch. In the midst of it all, the man in the beige sweater moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He knelt beside Evelyn, removing his sweater without hesitation and draping it gently over her legs, covering the soaked dress, shielding her from the eyes around her. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice low, steady. "I'm here." Evelyn looked at him, confused through tears. "Sir, you don't have to—" "I know," he said softly, "but I want to." Robert's laughter faltered. For the briefest second, his eyes met the man's. Something passed between them, something wordless and unsettling. Then Robert turned away, still scoffing, and stormed toward his office at the back of the restaurant. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. The door slammed shut behind him. The dining room remained frozen in silence. Mia held her grandmother, whispering apologies that weren't hers to give, and the man in the beige sweater stayed kneeling, one hand resting lightly on Evelyn's arm, as if standing guard. No one noticed him lean closer. No one heard what he whispered into her ear. But whatever he said made Evelyn close her eyes and breathe for the first time since the pain began. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting that had come before. No music played, no glasses clinked. Even the kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Mia stayed on her knees, arms wrapped around her grandmother, rocking slightly, as if that alone could ease the pain. Evelyn's face had gone pale, but she kept her eyes open, fixed on the man beside her, the one who had covered her legs without being asked, without expecting thanks. Around them, people avoided eye contact. Some stared at their plates. Some pretended to check their phones. Some whispered, but no one moved. No one except one. From near the kitchen doors, a young waiter took a step forward. His name was Ethan. He was 26 years old, barely making rent, working double shifts to help his mother pay medical bills. He had seen cruelty before, sharp words, short tempers, but never something like this. His hands trembled as he approached the table, holding a clean tray with fresh napkins and a glass of cold water. I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "What happened here, it shouldn't have." Mia looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "You don't have to apologize," she said bitterly. "You didn't do this." Ethan swallowed hard. "But I didn't stop it either." He set the tray down carefully, and that means something. He glanced toward the office door at the back of the restaurant, then back at Evelyn. "I'll bring you something warm to eat," he said. "On me. Not on the house. On me." Mia shook her head. "We don't want trouble for you." Ethan managed a small, sad smile. "I already decided." He turned and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 plates, simple food, nothing extravagant, but hot and carefully prepared. He placed them gently in front of Evelyn and Mia, as if setting something sacred down. Evelyn reached out and touched his hand. "You're a good young man," she said softly. "God sees you." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He nodded quickly, unable to speak, and walked away before anyone could notice. The man in the beige sweater watched everything in silence. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward the closed office door. Something in his expression changed. Not anger, not judgment, but a quiet sadness, deep and knowing. Behind that door, Robert Hale sat alone with a glass of whiskey, replaying the scene in his head and telling himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was right. He told himself he was powerful. He told himself he felt nothing. But somewhere, buried beneath the pride and the noise, a memory had begun to stir, and it would not stay buried for long. The office door closed with a dull, final thud. Robert Hale stood motionless for a moment, his back pressed against the dark wood, chest rising and falling faster than he cared to admit. The muffled sounds of the dining room faded, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. He walked to his desk and poured himself a glass of whiskey. The liquid splashed against the crystal, amber catching the light from the brass lamp overhead. He took a long drink, letting it burn his throat, welcoming the familiar sting. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "Absolutely ridiculous." He loosened his tie and dropped into his leather chair, staring at the wall lined with framed photographs. There he was, smiling beside city officials at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There he was again, shaking hands with investors, champagne flutes raised high. Proof, undeniable proof, that he had made it. Power, respect, control. That was what mattered, not some old woman in a wheelchair, not the looks from strangers, not the strange man in the beige sweater. Robert scoffed and took another drink, but as he leaned back, his gaze drifted to a photo near the corner of the wall, one he hadn't looked at in years. A much younger Robert stood beside a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile, his mother. He felt something tighten in his chest. "Don't start," he whispered, as if speaking to the photograph itself. His phone vibrated on the desk. A message from his wife, Claire. "Are you coming home late again? The kids already asked for you." Robert didn't respond. He set the phone face down and rubbed his temples. The whiskey wasn't working the way it usually did. The noise in his head was growing louder, not quieter. Without warning, a memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. He was 10 years old again, standing in a restaurant not unlike his own. His shoes were scuffed, his shirt a size too small. His mother stood beside him, clutching her purse tightly, smiling nervously at the host. They had saved for weeks. It was supposed to be a celebration. But the owner had looked them up and down and shaken his head. "Not tonight," the man had said coldly. "This isn't the place for people like you." Robert remembered the heat in his face, the laughter from a nearby table, the way his mother's smile had faltered but never fully disappeared. Outside she had knelt in front of him, brushing tears from his cheeks. "One day," she had whispered, "you'll rise higher than this. Just don't let it harden your heart." Robert slammed his glass down on the desk. "That's enough," he snapped, though no one was there to hear him. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I built this," he said aloud. "I earned this." A knock echoed softly on the office door. Robert froze. Another knock followed, calm, unhurried. "Mr. Hale," a familiar voice said from the other side. "May I come in?" Robert's heart skipped. He knew that voice, and for the first time that night, fear, not anger, crept into his bones. Robert stared at the office door. For a brief moment he considered pretending he hadn't heard anything, pretending he was busy, pretending he was still in control. But his feet didn't move. "Come in," he said finally, his voice rough. The door opened quietly. The man in the beige sweater stepped inside and closed it behind him with careful ease, as if this were not a confrontation, but a conversation long overdue. He didn't sit down. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. Robert straightened his shoulders. "You have a lot of nerve," he said, "walking into my office like this." The man nodded slightly. "I know." Robert let out a sharp laugh. "Do you? Because I don't think you understand who you're dealing with." "I understand exactly who you are," the man replied calmly. That sentence landed harder than Robert expected. He scoffed and reached for his glass. "Listen, whatever you think you saw out there—" "Why did you do it?" the man interrupted, not raising his voice. Robert paused, the glass halfway to his lips. "What?" "Why did you humiliate her?" the man asked again. "Why did you hurt her?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Because it's my restaurant. Because I decide who belongs." The man tilted his head slightly. "That's not the real reason." Robert slammed the glass onto the desk. "You don't know anything about me." The man stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough that Robert felt the space between them shrink. "You were afraid," the man said softly. Robert's chest tightened. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of remembering," the man replied. "Afraid of the boy you used to be." The room seemed to grow smaller. Robert shook his head. "That's ridiculous." "You grew up poor," the man continued, as if reading from a page Robert had burned years ago. "Your father worked construction. Your mother cleaned houses. You promised yourself no one would ever look down on you again." Robert's breath caught. "How do you know that?" he whispered. The man met his eyes. "Because I was there." Robert felt his pulse pounding in his ears. "Get out," he said, though his voice lacked force. "Get out of my office." But the man didn't move. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you saw yourself in that woman, and instead of facing it, you tried to destroy it." Robert's hands began to tremble. "That's not true," he muttered. "Isn't it?" the man asked gently. Silence stretched between them. Then the man took a step back. "Tonight, Robert," he said, his voice heavy with something like sorrow, "when you close your eyes, you will see what you buried long ago." Robert swallowed. "And then what?" "Then you'll be given a choice," the man replied. He turned toward the door. "A choice," he said over his shoulder, "to remain the man you are, or to return to the man you were meant to be." The door closed softly behind him. Robert stood alone, heart racing, staring at the empty space where the man had been, wondering why, for the first time in his life, power felt so small. Robert didn't remember driving home. He remembered the streetlights blurring past his windshield. He remembered gripping the steering wheel too tightly. He remembered the man's voice echoing in his head long after the office door had closed. You will be given a choice. At home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. His wife, Claire, had already gone to bed. The kids' doors were closed, small nightlights glowing beneath them. Robert loosened his tie, dropped it on the kitchen counter, and poured himself another drink. He didn't want it. He drank it anyway. When he finally lay down, sleep came fast, but not gently. He found himself standing outside a restaurant he hadn't seen in decades. The sign was old. The windows fogged with steam. He was smaller now, shorter. His hands were those of a child. Beside him stood his mother. She wore the same worn coat she'd had when money was tight, her purse clutched close to her chest. She smiled at him, hopeful, nervous. Inside, the restaurant was bright. Warm. Laughter spilled from every table. They stepped forward. A man blocked their way. Robert couldn't see his face, only his shoes. Polished, expensive. "This place isn't for you," the man said. Robert felt the sting before he felt the tears. He looked up at his mother. She knelt in front of him, just as she had that night long ago, brushing his hair back gently. "Don't let this make you cruel," she whispered. "Promise me." The scene shifted. Robert was older now, standing in his own restaurant, rich, powerful. Across from him sat Evelyn Carter in her wheelchair, soup dripping from her dress, her eyes not angry, just wounded. He tried to speak. No sound came out. The room darkened. Then he saw the man in the beige sweater. But now the man was different. Light surrounded him, not blinding, but alive. Warm. His eyes held the weight of every sorrow Robert had ever known. He lifted his hands. In his palms were scars, deep, real, like nail marks. Robert fell to his knees. "Why are you here?" he cried. "Why me?" The man stepped closer. "Because you are lost," he said gently, "and the lost are always worth finding." The images collided, his mother crying on a sidewalk, Evelyn trembling in her wheelchair, his own children staring at him in fear instead of love. "Choose," the man said. Robert screamed and woke up. He sat bolt upright in bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding so violently he thought it might break his ribs. The room was dark, silent. Claire stirred beside him. "Robert?" she murmured. "Are you okay?" He couldn't answer. His chest burned. His hands shook. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, Robert Hale cried, not from anger, not from frustration, but from the terrifying realization that everything he had built might be standing on the wrong foundation. And that morning, when the sun rose, he would have to decide what to do with the truth. Robert didn't sleep again that night. He sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, elbows on his knees, staring into the dark as if it might speak back. Claire asked him once more if he was all right. He told her it was just a bad dream. It wasn't. When the first light crept through the curtains, Robert stood up, showered in silence, and dressed with hands that still trembled. He skipped breakfast. He skipped coffee. His mind was already somewhere else. The drive back to the restaurant felt longer than usual. Every red light felt like an accusation. Every billboard felt hollow. When he passed a small church on the corner, doors open, candles lit, he felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest. He didn't stop. The Alamo Grill House was still closed when he arrived. No staff, no music, no clatter of plates. He unlocked the back door and stepped inside. The restaurant looked exactly the same as it always had, and yet it didn't. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. Robert walked slowly between the tables, his shoes echoing against the floor. He stopped near the window, the table where the man in the beige sweater had been sitting. Something lay on the tabletop, a single folded piece of paper. Robert frowned. He was certain he had locked up the night before. No one should have been inside. With cautious steps, he approached the table and picked it up. His name was written on the front. Robert. His throat tightened. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, unhurried. Pride builds walls. Repentance opens doors. You are still in time. Go to her. Ask for forgiveness. Not from me, from her. Robert's hands began to shake. He read it again, and again. A chill ran through him, not fear, but something closer to awe. How? He whispered to the empty room. He sat down heavily in the chair by the window, the note clutched in his fist. The words burned in his mind. Go to her. But where would he even begin? Then something struck him. The man had known Evelyn's name. Robert had never asked, never heard it spoken aloud. Yet the man had said it. Slowly, Robert stood and walked back to his office. He turned on the computer and began searching. Public records, local directories, social media groups. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, a name appeared. Evelyn Carter, age 78, West San Antonio. Robert printed the address and stared at it, his heart pounding. This was it. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. For the first time in his adult life, Robert Hale felt afraid, not of losing power, not of being embarrassed, but of facing the person he had hurt. He locked the restaurant behind him and stepped into the morning sun. Whatever awaited him at that address, he knew one thing with certainty. There was no turning back. The neighborhood was nothing like the places Robert usually drove through. The streets were narrow, the houses were small, pressed close together, their paint faded by years of sun and struggle. Children kicked a worn soccer ball between parked cars. An old man swept his porch slowly, methodically, as if time itself had learned to move gently here. Robert's luxury sedan felt out of place. He parked across the street and sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. The note in his jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have. Go to her. He stepped out of the car. Each footstep toward the house felt deliberate, measured, like walking toward a verdict. The address on the paper matched the small, one-story home with a crooked mailbox and a flower pot hanging by the door. Robert raised his hand and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, softer this time. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened just a few inches. Mia Carter stood there. Her eyes were red. Her expression shifted instantly, from surprise to fury. "You," she said sharply. "What are you doing here?" Robert swallowed. "I need to speak with your grandmother." Mia laughed bitterly. "You've done enough. She was in pain all night. She has burns. She has a fever." Each word hit him like a blow. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding small even to his own ears. "Sorry?" Mia snapped. "Do you have any idea what you did to her?" "I do," Robert replied quietly, "and that's why I'm here." She shook her head. "We don't want anything from you. Not your money, not your apologies." She began to close the door. Then a weak voice came from inside. "Mia," it said gently, "let him in." Mia froze. "Grandma." "Please," Evelyn's voice continued, "let him come." Mia hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly. Robert entered the house. The air smelled of coffee and something floral, lavender maybe. The living room was small but immaculate. Family photographs lined the walls. Decades of life captured in frames. Evelyn sat by the window in her wheelchair, a blanket over her legs, and over that blanket, the beige sweater. Robert felt his chest tighten. He approached slowly, unsure where to look, unsure how to begin. Evelyn studied him calmly. "You came," she said. Robert nodded. "I didn't deserve to," he replied, "but I couldn't stay away." He sank to his knees in front of her, his composure finally breaking. "What I did was cruel," he said, his voice shaking. "There's no excuse. I humiliated you. I hurt you, and I am so deeply sorry." Tears spilled freely now. "I became the very thing I swore I'd never be." The room fell silent. Evelyn looked down at him, at the powerful man kneeling like a child, and reached out, resting her hand gently on his head. I know, she said softly. Robert looked up, stunned. How? He whispered. Evelyn smiled faintly. Because I saw your pain before you saw mine. And in that moment, something inside Robert finally broke open. Robert stayed on his knees, unable to lift his head. Evelyn's hand rested lightly on his hair, not as a gesture of power, but as a mother might touch a child who has finally stopped running. I know, she repeated gently. I saw your pain before you saw mine. Robert's chest tightened. You don't understand, he said, his voice breaking. What I did was unforgivable. Evelyn shook her head slowly. No, she said. What you did was human. Mia stood near the doorway, arms crossed, her whole body tense. She wanted to interrupt, wanted to remind her grandmother of the burns, the fever, the humiliation. But something in Evelyn's voice made her stay silent. Robert wiped his face with the back of his hand. I spent my whole life trying to never feel small again, he said. I thought if I became powerful enough, no one could hurt me. He let out a shaky breath. But last night, when I looked at you, I didn't see a stranger. I saw myself, and I hated it. Evelyn listened without interrupting. I hated the boy I used to be, Robert continued. Poor, ashamed, powerless. So I tried to destroy that reflection instead of facing it. He bowed his head. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Life went on, unaware that something sacred was unfolding in that small living room. Do you know what the man told me last night? Evelyn asked. Robert looked up. The man in the beige sweater? She nodded. He said, Justice will come, but not the way you expect. Robert felt a chill run through him. He told me, she continued, that justice sometimes comes as a broken heart, as tears that finally tell the truth, as repentance. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady, and that forgiveness is not saying what happened was okay, she said. It's choosing not to let it poison the future. Robert's lips trembled. I forgive you, Evelyn said. The words were simple, quiet, but they landed with the weight of a miracle. Robert gasped as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. You forgive me? He whispered. Yes, she replied, because God forgave me long before I learned how to forgive others. Tears streamed down Robert's face freely now. Mia stepped forward. Grandma, Evelyn raised a hand gently. I know, my love. She turned back to Robert. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, she said. You still have work to do, lives to heal, hearts to make right. Robert nodded desperately. I'll do anything, he said. Anything. Then start by changing, Evelyn said. Not with words, with actions. She gestured to the sweater on her lap. He gave me this when I was cold and humiliated, she added softly. He told me justice would come through repentance. Robert stared at the sweater. Who was he asked, his voice barely audible. Evelyn smiled, a knowing, peaceful smile. I don't know, she said, but he had the kindest eyes I've ever seen. Robert felt his heart pounding, because deep down he already knew, and for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of what that meant. Robert left the small house on the west side with slow, unsteady steps. The sun was higher now, but the warmth didn't reach him. His mind replayed Evelyn's words again and again, I forgive you, as if they were written into his bones. He sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. And, for the first time, he didn't want to. He drove back downtown in silence, the city moving around him as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. When he arrived at the Alamo Grill House, something was wrong. The front door was unlocked. Robert frowned. He was certain he had locked it before leaving. He stepped inside cautiously. The dining room was empty. No staff, no music, no sound at all, except for someone breathing. Robert froze. Near the window, that window, sat a man. The beige sweater was unmistakable. Robert's heart began to pound. "How did you get in here?" he whispered. The man looked up and smiled, not triumphantly, not knowingly, but with a quiet tenderness that made Robert's chest ache. "There are doors no key can lock," the man said, "doors of the heart." Robert stepped closer, his legs trembling. "Who are you?" he asked again. "Tell me the truth." The man stood. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing his face in a soft glow that felt alive. Not blinding, not dramatic, just real. "I never left you, Robert," the man said gently, "even when you walked away." Robert's breath hitched. "That night, in the office, the dream, the note." The man nodded. "You were finally ready to hear." Robert swallowed hard. "Evelyn forgave me." "I know," the man replied. "Her mercy made room for yours." Robert took another step forward. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you come for someone like me?" The man raised his hands, and Robert saw them clearly now. Scars, not faint, not symbolic, deep marks in the flesh, as if nails had once passed through them. Robert's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, not out of choice, but because his body could no longer hold the weight of understanding. "No," he whispered, "I don't deserve this." The man knelt in front of him, bringing their eyes level. "Who told you love is earned?" he asked softly. "Love is received." Tears streamed down Robert's face. "I hurt people," Robert sobbed. "I humiliated the weak. I ignored my family. I lived for myself." "I know," the man said. "And still—" Robert choked. "You came?" The man placed one scarred hand gently on Robert's shoulder. "I came because you were lost," he said. "And the lost are always worth finding." Robert looked up through tears. "What do I do now?" "Begin again," the man replied. "You cannot change the past, but you can redeem what comes next." Robert nodded, shaking. "I'll change. I swear it." The man smiled sadly. "Don't swear," he said. "Just choose, one day at a time." He stood and walked toward the door. "Wait," Robert called out. "Will I see you again?" The man paused, placing a hand over Robert's chest. "You see me every time you choose compassion over pride," he said. "Every time you feed the hungry. Every time you lift the forgotten." He opened the door. "I am closer than you think." And then he was gone, not vanished, not dissolved, just gone. Robert remained on the floor, pressing his hand to his chest, where his heart was racing, not with fear, but with something new, purpose. For the first time in his life, Robert Hale knew exactly who had found him, and exactly what he was being called to become. Change did not arrive with thunder, it came quietly. The very next morning, Robert Hale woke before his alarm. The house was still dark, the city not yet stirring. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, and for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone. Instead, he bowed his head. The words did not come easily. They were not polished. They were not rehearsed. "Help me," he whispered. "I don't know how to do this, but I want to." When he opened his eyes, Claire was standing in the doorway, watching him with a mix of confusion and caution. "Are you okay?" she asked. Robert looked up at her, the woman he had loved once with sincerity, before ambition had crowded everything else out. "I haven't been," he said honestly, "but I want to be." They sat at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed. Robert told her everything, not just what had happened at the restaurant, but what had been happening inside him for years, the anger, the fear of being small again, the way success had slowly hollowed him out. Claire listened in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Are you really going to change?" Robert nodded. "Not perfectly," he said, "but truly." That afternoon he went back to the restaurant. The staff had already gathered, whispering nervously. They expected yelling, demands, damage control. Instead, Robert stood in front of them with his hands open and his voice unguarded. "I need to ask for your forgiveness," he said. The room froze. "For years, I treated you like tools instead of people," he continued. "I raised my voice. I humiliated you. I made you afraid to make mistakes." He looked directly at Ethan. "And I watched you do the right thing while I did the wrong one." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to say. "I can't undo what I've done," Robert said, "but I can change what happens next." He announced immediate raises, fair scheduling, full benefits. But more than that, he promised something that stunned them all. "No one will ever be turned away from this place for being poor again," he said. "Not ever." The words felt heavy and right. That Friday, Robert made another decision. He removed 2 large tables near the window and replaced them with a simple sign written by hand. "Friday table. Anyone who's hungry is welcome. No questions. No conditions." The first Friday, only 3 people came: a man who hadn't eaten in 2 days, a single mother with a toddler, an elderly veteran with shaking hands. Robert seated them at the best table in the house. "Eat," he said, "as much as you need." Word spread quietly. The second Friday there were 12. By the fourth there were nearly 50. Something unexpected happened. Regular customers began to notice. A businessman asked if he could sponsor 10 meals. A baker from down the street began dropping off fresh bread every Friday morning. Someone left envelopes of cash with no return address. The restaurant changed. Laughter returned, but different now, softer, real. At home, change continued. Robert came home early. He ate dinner with his family. He listened instead of correcting. He apologized when he failed. One night his son asked him, "Dad, why are you different?" Robert smiled gently. "Because someone found me when I was lost." And then there was Evelyn. Robert visited her again, not with money, not with grand promises, but with consistency. He paid for medical care quietly, fixed what needed fixing around her home, listened. The beige sweater still rested folded neatly in her living room. Justice came, she told him one afternoon, just like he said it would. Robert nodded. He finally understood. Justice had not come to destroy him. It had come to remake him, and this was only the beginning. 1 year later, the sign by the window was still there. It wasn't fancy, just a piece of wood, slightly worn at the edges, rewritten every few months in careful handwriting. "Friday table, anyone who's hungry is welcome." By then, thousands of meals had been served. Not leftovers, not scraps, but the same food given to paying guests, hot, dignified, generous. People began calling it the restaurant that changed, but Robert Hale knew the truth. The restaurant hadn't changed first, he had. On a quiet afternoon, after the lunch crowd had thinned, Robert stood alone near the window where it had all begun. Sunlight spilled across the table just as it had that night. Sometimes he still half expected to see a man in a beige sweater sitting there. He never did. And yet, he did. He saw him in the eyes of the man who hadn't eaten in days, in the hands of volunteers washing dishes without complaint, in the laughter of children eating without fear of being turned away. He remembered the words spoken to him. "You see me every time you choose compassion over pride." Robert had stopped asking why he was chosen. He had learned that love doesn't explain itself. It simply invites. Evelyn passed away peacefully that spring. At her small funeral, Robert sat in the back, unnoticed. When it was his turn to approach the casket, he placed the beige sweater inside, folded carefully, reverently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it." That night, Robert returned to the restaurant and stayed long after everyone had gone home. He turned off the lights one by one and stood alone beneath the cross, now hanging quietly on the wall. "I won't waste it," he said aloud. "I promise." He knew he would still fail sometimes. He would still struggle. But he also knew this: transformation doesn't require perfection. It only requires surrender. And now, this story turns toward you who are listening right now. Maybe you recognized yourself in Robert. Maybe you recognized yourself in Evelyn. Maybe you were the one who stayed silent, like the crowd. Or maybe you were the one who stepped forward, like Ethan. Wherever you found yourself in this story, know this: it wasn't an accident. Because sometimes Jesus doesn't knock loudly. He doesn't arrive with thunder or miracles that blind the eyes. Sometimes he comes disguised as a story about a woman in a wheelchair, a man blinded by pride, a stranger who refused to look away. And the question he asks is never, "Are you good enough?" The question is always simpler and harder. What will you choose next? Will you choose compassion when pride feels easier? Will you choose humility when power tempts you? Will you choose love, even when it costs you something? If this story touched your heart, don't let the moment pass. Take a second to subscribe to the YouTube channel Heaven Walks With Us, so you don't miss stories that remind us who we are and who we're called to be. Share this video with someone who needs hope today, and if you feel led, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what part of this story spoke to you most? Because your story matters too, and maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end of a story at all. Maybe it's the beginning of yours.